Wellesley College in the USA. She's an award-winning feminist sociologist and educator. She researches gender, globalization, finance, and development in India, the US, and South Africa. She's the author of 4 books and an editor of an edited volume that lays out a new agenda for sociology as a discipline. Her most recent book, The Gender Order of Neoliberalism, with Cynthia Solaris, integrates her research on feminist political economy, development, and nationalism. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley in 2006. Radhakrishnan is also a lifelong Indian classical dancer, having trained extensively with acclaimed teachers in the US and India, and performed extensively in the US and South Africa. Currently, she directs Natya Dance Collective, a group of rigorously trained dancers producing original work that centers social justice themes. Natya's most recent work, Radical Love, a collective movement, premiered in Cambridge, Massachusetts in January 2024. With that, I want to extend an extremely warm welcome to Prof. Smita Radhakrishnan, who is going to take us through her dialogue. And I think it's a moving dialogue on moving hearts, minds, and bodies. Over to you, Prof. Radhakrishnan.
Thank you so much for the warm and generous welcome, Dr. Gopal, and thanks to all of you for organizing this webinar. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Tando, for taking care of all the logistics, and to Kurt and Shania for being here to share the space, and all of you as participants. I'm really happy to be here. So this is a talk that in a way melds 2 parallel streams of my life in many ways. As Professor Gopal indicated, I'm a sociologist by training and a scholar who has spent most of my career thinking about feminist political economy and feminist development studies, gender-based things, not necessarily violence per se, but in parallel, I have been a lifelong dancer. And this is a moment where I see the 2 converging, and I hope that I can guide you through what I see to be my vision and contribution to thinking about gender-based violence through the lens of feminist social science. All right, so for today's webinar, I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction about how I became a dancing sociologist and why I think that history matters. A little bit of a preview of what feminist social science is and why I think we need it to understand gender-based violence. This is moving away from the prevailing psychological or policy-based frameworks that we see, and why I think feminist social science really moves us in a more empowering direction to think about gender-based violence. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the embodied message, what it means to center the body and thinking about social transformation around gender-based violence, and finally give you an example of dance for healing, a first step towards building a caring world. All right, so a little bit first about my own background, which Professor Gopal spoke about a little bit, but I'd like to give you a little bit more personal background on that. So I grew up in, let's see, here we go. I grew up as an immigrant daughter. Professor Gopal indicated that I have heritage in South Asia. So indeed, both my parents were born and raised in India and moved to the United States. I was born in the United States, so they moved to the United States in the 70s. And I grew up in Arizona in a very, there's a certain connotation with living in a white-dominated environment in South Africa. It's different in the United States, although we have similar levels of segregation. I grew up in a suburb which was white because there weren't any Indian neighborhoods, and was the only kind of one of my kind in my school, which was extremely isolating. However, in our small Indian community in Arizona, there was a wonderful opportunity to learn Bharatanatyam, Indian classical dance, and that became an important form of identification. So although Indian immigrants in the United States are regarded as quote unquote model minorities. There's a whole history behind that term. In the US, immigrant groups, including Indians, do face racism and exclusion, which is something that is not well known outside of the United States. We hear about police violence against African Americans. Asian Americans are also positioned in a very kind of contradictory way, where we appear to be very visible, as you can see from the current presidential ticket, and yet we are also isolated in many ways. So I faced a lot of exclusion and marginalization at school. And at the same time, at home, there was a different value system that was being promoted, which was to say that if you are not Indian, right, you are not actually being ethical, and being American, completely American on the inside, was frowned upon. I was at a panel yesterday on nationalism where I was speaking, and I recalled an instance where, when I was growing up, my dad was very clear about informing me that, Smith, I never forget that you're an American, right? And I actually thought he was making fun of me because I didn't understand how having birthright citizenship as an American citizen had anything to do with being American, because I thought that the thing I really should be is Indian, right? And that speaks to the depth of the exclusion I faced, as well as the identification with Indianness. So now, fast forward many years, I start studying sociology, and I start thinking globally about this identity, this very kind of narrow experience that I had growing up. And this global sociological imagination allowed me to connect South Africa, India, and my location in what was then California in the United States through this expansive understanding of history and biography. So when I ended up at UC Berkeley, my subsequent PhD really showed me that my biography as an Indian American in the United States was part of a much larger history of colonial migrations that had started, under colonialism, Indian people fleeing the British Raj to end up in the United States as early as the 19th century, right? And so if we think about Indians in South Africa who had been brought over during indenture, there were also folks who were coming over, fleeing British rule and coming to the United States undocumented, very different structures. And then almost a century later, right, my parents end up coming here as immigrant laborers. So there's a really long global history that connects these three places that I had previously never been exposed to. I also started revisiting my dance background, which by this time had become a big part of my life, and really started thinking about the extent to which dancing, right, was what made me human. I was always an academic and working on that. But when I spent time in South Africa, spent time in, other part in India, the thing which connected me to others was the capacity and the interest in dancing, in being a sweating body in the studio, imbibing, a classical art form that was difficult, that was detailed, that took a lot of work, and that brought me joy in a way that my studies were not necessarily doing. And so this idea kind of started to take shape that people in very different places can be organized by similar structures of privilege and oppression. So if we think about caste in India, caste divisions between rural and urban, gender divisions, think about those same things in the context of South Africa, where I was living in Durban and hanging out with, some of you might know Dr. Surya Govender. I was part of Sri Lanka Dance Company, touring with them, learning about the entire vocabulary of Zulu and Indian dance interactions in KwaZulu-Natal. And then on the other hand, kind of coming from a background in California, all of these things really made me think about how, even though these are very different from each other, there are similar structures that are organizing them across race, class, and gender. Okay, how did these things start to come together? I started studying feminism and feminist theory very seriously as a graduate student, and was deeply inspired by the visions of feminists of color that I studied. I encountered Black, Chicana, and third world feminism as a PhD student, and this gave me a new perspective and vocabulary through which to view myself and the world. And just sharing a few insights that are relevant to the topic that we have on board today. Some keywords that were particularly important to me: margin to center, so bell hooks up here in the upper left, one of my role models, a thinker way ahead of her time. She said that in order to be able to imagine a just world, we need to be able to look at those who are on the margins of society and bring them to the center of our thinking, right? And she's thinking here about Black women in the context of the United States, but this concept is helpful in many different ways, thinking about how marginality can actually help us illuminate the center. This has been a very important idea in my own thinking, my own scholarly work. Chandra Mohanty wrote a key article in the 1980s called Under Western Eyes, which focused on the extent to which a Western perspective frames our understanding of gender issues in the so-called third world, right? Really thinking about the way that we can't look at gender issues in places like India or South Africa from the perspective of the women who are experiencing them, but are instead always looking at them from the view of an outsider, an external gaze. Also a really critical, important issue to think about gender-based violence, right? What happens when you think from the perspective of those who are experiencing it versus from a perspective that it's influenced by a Western colonial gaze that assumes that there is something to fix. Patricia Hill Collins is another idol of mine. And she, along with Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminists, have really pioneered this understanding of intersectionality, which is nothing more than complex inequality, right? It means thinking broadly about justice, not just in terms of gender justice, not just in terms of racial justice, but thinking of gender, class, and racial justice together, along with structures like disability, age, and even immigration status, right, and nation. How do all of those things intersect to constitute a particular experience? And then finally, not to be last but not least, Gloria Anzaldua's The Latina Feminist Understanding of Borderlands was also really important to me because Anzaldúa emphasizes for us that as feminist thinkers, we need not be in one category or another, but in fact that we traverse those borders. And she talks about the borderland as her back, right? And for me as well, being between and betwixt cultures, being able to move between them is definitely something that I identify with and that affected me personally, right? And also affects the way that I think, that we're thinking across borders and across context. Okay, so that brings me to this idea of dancing radical love. And this is one image from our most recent production that Professor Gopal mentioned, dancing called Radical Love, a Collective Movement, which for me is a culmination of all these things. The way that we thought about radical love comes out of this kind of feminist thinking, right? Radical love is love that is not about immediate family or about romantic love, but about the love that we generate within a community, the love and care that we have for one another that can be brought through coming together as a community in times of grief in order to heal from our past traumas. So I'll talk a little bit more about that production in a moment. Okay, so why do we need feminist social science in order to understand GBV? So pivoting away from the personal to thinking about these more complex and structural issues. So many of you would already have all of you would have some familiarity with GBV. Certainly it's become a huge issue of public action in South Africa and is important around the world for thinking about the ways that bodies identified as women, but also including trans bodies, are subjected to violence of all kinds. So what are the prevailing frames that we have around this? They are really around the physical body and violence to the physical body. They are around punishing perpetrators, taking through a particular legal system, and perhaps, making sure that the victims of gender-based violence find safety, right? And all of those things are really, really important. And I'm not dismissing any of those things in any way, but simply arguing that feminist social science really gives us another set of tools for thinking about this. So what might those be? Feminist social science at the core begs us to question the status quo, right? So when we are thinking about gender-based violence, right, we need to go beyond just saying, oh, we shouldn't have that. and really think about what are the conditions that make it likely for that type of violence to take place. And that's a very deep set of questions that often remains unanswered when we get down to a very instrumental understanding of gender-based violence that's just about getting things done. Again, going back to bell hooks, feminist social science says, let's bring those who are on the margin to the center of our analysis. So if we are thinking about gender-based violence, it means that what about those who are ignored in this entire framework? So rather than centering those who are trying to solve the problem, which often those of us who are scholars or policymakers tend to center ourselves, how is it that we can think not only of those who are victims, which definitely we should bring those or sort of survivors to the center, but also those who are likely to, who are at high risk for this, right? So if those folks are actually brought to the center and we center their experiences, even before it comes to the point of gender-based violence, how would that change our view? Thinking about structure and agency as both mattering. This is also critical for understanding the way that we think about gender, not just as a variable, men and women, but as a structure, a system of power, right? How are opportunities sorted differently? How is the labor market structured for men and women? How do class and gender intersect to organize opportunities around education, work, thriving, even beauty, ability, disability, who has access to those things and under what circumstances? If we are not considering structure as we are also considering identity, then there's no way that we can heal these deep wounds. There's no way that we can move forward on them. And very often, because of the dominance of psychology in this field, we neglect the structural aspects of gender, right? And just reduce it to a variable where we're thinking already without any examination about women who have experienced extreme physical violence, when in fact we need to think more broadly about the systems that cause harm to folks who may identify with many different genders. And then finally, this last part, which feminist social science demands of us, is to be visionary. It is not enough to criticize and to solve what we have right now, right, if that's even possible, but also to imagine what kind of a world would we like to live in. If we're not actively asking this question of what kind of a world would we like to live in, we are never going to get there. Naomi Klein, a brilliant writer and analyst and honorary sociologist, as far as I'm concerned, during COVID, she picked up on this. She sort of, in a lot of her webinars and teachings, was starting to say, history is made by those who, during a crisis, pick up ideas that are lying around. So our job, right, is to make feminist ideas that center justice as an idea that's lying around so that in times of crisis, it will be looked at. If we don't articulate those ideas, especially as scholars and thinkers within the university, then we will not have those possibilities available when there is an opportunity to build the world that we would like. We can't come up with it then, right? We have to come up with it now. So if we're not visionary about what that would look like, we are never actually going to get there. All right. So who can we use to think about these things? So I'm not the first person to say gender-based violence is structural. Juanita Elias and Shireen Rai, who I admire very much as sort of feminist thinkers of political economy. So they are, a pair of scholars who are arguing in their work that they're arguing for an integration between approaches to violence, which tend to lie in the realm of the psychological, and what they call, and I would also call, political economy approaches to gender that are concerned with the structure of the global economy and the nation states that constitute it, right? So this is getting us to think multi-scalar, right? And getting us to advance the way that we expand the way that we are thinking about violence beyond the body, but still including the body as a site. So from their article, Elias and Rai say violence against women both underpins and is perpetuated by the process of global economic transformation. We seek to interrogate the costs of violence by focusing on the everyday human rather than the economic costs of violence alone, right? So this really shifts the focus from extraordinary acts of violence that are visited upon particular bodies to everyday routine acts of violence that take place as a result of the violent world that we live in. So what are some of the things that they are interested in? They focus on 3 strands of violence of the everyday in the global political economy. My slides are not going here. Here we go. Right. So one is the pervasiveness of violence within feminized global zones of work, right? So these are workplaces that have been produced by the global economy, whether it's factories, whether it is retail workplaces of various kinds, right? How is there violence and harassment within that? Women's experience of violence in public spaces, especially relating to mobility and public transport. This is something that's a huge issue in South Africa, also in India, right? That just being out and about opens up women to violence, and that there's a relationship between women's subordination in the household, right, and the forms of violence that they experience. So if you are already in a subordinate position in the household, you are much more likely to experience violence. And then if you connect that to the way that you move around in space and the conditions that you experience at work, then you are much more likely to experience violence. And just because you present as a man, or just because you present, as a more masculine woman, for example, doesn't mean that you are protected from these forms of harm. We could add to this list, so that Shireen Rai and Juanita Elias give us these 3, but we could also add to that vulnerability in digital spaces that can translate into in-person harm or violence. Our digital lives increasingly overlap with our in-person lives. We can also add the lack of representation in legal infrastructures, which lead to a normalization of violence, right? So when we start thinking about everyday gender-based violence in the system as a whole, right, it really opens up our lens for thinking about gender-based violence as a whole, and it takes us away in a way from the body, and yet we are also always thinking about the body, but we are just not limiting it to those extreme acts when harm is visited upon the body, but thinking about it much more broadly and thinking about the causes in a deeper way than just the context of an interpersonal relationship between a man and a woman. So when you put all that together, right, what I'd like to convince you of, right, that GBV is spectral. It exists on a spectrum, right, of which violence is only the culmination. This should have gone in the other direction, but humor me, right? So we have actually, we can start from this side, right? We can think of violence as being the thing which we see on the outside, right? That is the moment of extreme harm that is visited upon the body, right? But before that, there is harm. Before violence is actually visited upon the body, there is harm, right? There is, then we could think of as being maybe not explicit violence, but an ongoing kind of violence. There is, before that, depletion, right? Not getting enough to eat, not getting enough rest, not getting enough leisure time in order to replenish, right? Which can then make you more susceptible to harm. And then, even before depletion, there is neglect, right? Not getting enough care, not getting enough attention, right? So all of these things, if we think about gender-based violence as a spectrum that starts with neglect and culminates in this spectacular violence on the body, you get a very different understanding of where gender-based violence is coming from. And it also opens up a lot more sites for thinking about how, even if you have not experienced that bodily violence, right, extreme violence, you may have experienced harm, depletion, or neglect, which also builds a much broader base for gender-based organizing in order to mobilize towards the world that we would like to build upon, right? So it's not just victims or survivors and those who are, never to have experienced it, but actually those with multiple gender identities who have experienced this kind of harm as a result of a set of structures in an overarching system. So I would love to, take your questions about this. This is something that I'm thinking about actively, and would love your feedback from a South African perspective or from your own personal perspective as well. Okay, so moving on to this next section about the embodied message. So how do we move from this abstract intellectual idea to the bigger fish that we want to fry, which is really about social transformation? So I want to invite us to think about embodiment in two different ways. One is about how the mind is embedded in the body, right? So we are not just a free-flowing intellect, right? Those of us who publish books or write things, it's as if we don't have a body at all. But in fact, right, we are not able to come up with, any kind of intellectual products unless the body is cared for. So the mind is embedded in the body. As scholars, as folks who are in the university who are doing the work of the mind, we have to be very aware of the fact that that mind exists within a body that has to be cared for in order for the intellect to be able to do the work. Secondly, the body itself is embedded in an environment, right? And we just talked about some of the broader structural dimensions of the environment that we might live in, whether it's a work environment, school environment, urban environment. But that body is taking in the protections and harms of that particular environment that we might be living in. So when we think about embodiment, right, we need to be thinking about it in this multi-scalar way, right? And often when we think about the body, we instead think about it in a very abstract way, as if it could be a body that could be anywhere, in a white room, as it were, right? But in fact, the real bodies, all of our bodies, are embedded in a particular environment, and all of our bodies are housing that mind and that intellect that has to come up with these ideas in order to be able to move forward in the world. Another way of thinking about it is this oyster of oppression, which is something that I've learned about in multiple contexts and might be useful here. We've got the individual, right? But that individual is just existing within these multiple spheres of influence. That it is existing within an interpersonal sphere. So often we think of interpersonal in terms of one person against another, but in fact, that is an entire environment, right? Those interpersonal interactions, one-on-one, exist within an institutional environment, such as UKZN, such as the University of Wellesley College, where I work, right? Or any other working environment that we might find ourselves. And then that institution exists within a wider landscape of societal and cultural norms. So just as there is a co-constitutive relationship between our individual thoughts and actions and the society we live in, there is a relationship between our bodies and the world. And we need to really be aware of that when we are thinking about how to approach gender-based violence. If we address, in order to address GBV, it requires individual change, definitely, but not just at the mental level. The body has to be healed, engaged, and nurtured into renewal and sustainability, right? And so rather than kind of thinking about just prevent that violent harm, punish the perpetrators, protect the survivors, now we're thinking in a much deeper way, right, about how the individual needs to be addressed within the body, right, and how that body needs to be healed from its past traumas in order to be able to move forward, and that is a collective project. That's not an individual project. It's not a legal project. It's something which has to engage all of us at multiple levels and in multiple modalities. So that brings me to the title of the talk, right? That addressing GBV requires us to move minds, hearts, and bodies in order to drive social transformation. And that brings me to my last section. I think I'm doing okay on time. Professor Gopal, do I have about how much more time do I have? About 6, 7 minutes? I think so. All right, so I will.
About 6 minutes.
Okay,
Sorry.
perfect. That's perfect. So this last section, Dance for Healing, will share a little bit about my own work on this and hopefully give us an idea of what this might look like. So this is another shot of another photograph from the production Radical Love. This particular piece was called Grief is the Price of Love. And it drew from the writings of activist and writer Valerie Carr, who wrote an amazing book called See No Stranger that I really consumed during the pandemic at a time of personal grief for myself. We made this piece, we took prose from the actual text. We worked with a composer, a Sikh composer, who composed music based on a Sikh a kirtan from the Sikh faith and made an entire song of it. And we made up folk movements in order to work through that grief. Now, the other woman in this picture in the foreground with me, Aditi, who's in my group, had lost her parent during COVID. And so this process of grieving was very near and dear to her heart. So we worked on this together. And as we were making the piece, right, you can see us touching each other, holding hands, grieving together. In this particular shot, right, we are talking about the joy of being together. And then at the end of this scene, I break away from her, leaving her alone, right? And we actually physically experienced that grief of breaking away from someone you love and being left alone. But then I kind of joined this line in the back, right? And in this line of dancers in the back represent the ancestors, the background, the community to which we belong, that's always looking after us. And in the piece, that community eventually envelops her, brings her back with love, and heals her to uplift her from the grief that she has suffered. So what is the message here? The message is about inner sustainability. So Horwitz, Korosek, and Thurell argued that discussions of sustainability, when we think about climate sustainability, tend to ignore the inner sustainability that's required for interpersonal and intergroup trust, which is actually a foundation for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So inner sustainability involves the values, the beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, identities, and emotions that serve as the inner foundation for sustainable behaviors, behaviors that do not deplete people's resources in the long run. So in that frame that I showed you, in that moment of dance that I talked about, right, all of us were building up our inner reserves in being there for each other, even in a dance, right? That was abstract, that was touching upon many of our experiences, but actually acting it out was building up that reserve of inner sustainability in order to build resilience for us in other areas. So there is significant research to suggest that dance promotes this inner sustainability. Dance training links feelings with physical movement such that dance movements themselves become resonant with feelings. There is neurobiological research to suggest that dance activates the nervous system in a way that improves brain function, improves communication between the synapses. Those of us who engage in dance, that most human of activities, which is now sometimes kind of ghettoized as something that only women do or only certain people do, but it's the most human thing. And when you dance, right, and when you dance with others in particular, your brain is very happy, right? And there's research to even suggest that when we dance with others in sync, we build trust and cohesion, especially with those that have divergent social identities. There was one study that showed that when you dance with strangers, you actually remember the faces of those that you are dancing in sync with. So there's something about that that is very powerful. So I'd like to kind of conclude or open up the discussion by thinking about healing through dance as a first step to imagining this inner sustainability that can heal us at these multiple levels of the individual, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the societal, because the embodied character of dance make it an amazing modality through which to work through every scale of this oyster, right? So you are making the dance, right, with yourself and perhaps with a group of people, right? And then you are sharing it with the world, maybe at an institution. So there's the individual, the interpersonal, the institutional. And then as you put that work out in the world, partly as I'm doing right now, right, there is an impact on the societal and the social that reverberates out. And then people walk away with that new feeling within them, right? So even just the act of performing dance, or even if you're not performing it, if you're sharing it, we've done a lot of community-based work, right, that shares it in that way. So this is what is this ultimately about? It's about cultivating joy, and cultivating joy promotes that inner sustainability. And there's many ways that we can do it. I've been talking to you about a culturally specific form of music and movement. And I would argue that, very often we think that we need to get out of our cultures in order to be able to come up with something that works for everyone. But what I've tried to argue with you or convince you of in this webinar is that delving deeply into our ancestral and heritage-based cultures, right? Whether it's through dance or any other kind of movement, can actually help us mobilize and build up that inner sustainability, connect with others, and then others can connect with it in whatever way that they would like. When I presented this work in Pretoria at Tshwane University of Technology at TUT, the dance students there connected my message that I had presented through an Indian and contemporary dance form through their African ways of knowing and being, and didn't think that they were that different at all. So culturally specific movement and music is actually a starting point for this kind of healing. Centering dance addresses our cultural discomfort with the body, which is also key to healing from gender-based violence. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about this, but I think we live in a world where there's a fundamental cultural discomfort with body, especially in the academy. And this is something that we can deal with when we engage the body through dance. Centering caring touch. We often know very little about what it means to touch each other in a caring way, and this is something that we can cultivate further. Inclusive pedagogy in the classroom is also something that reduces hierarchies. There are specific classroom practices that we can engage with in order to do that. Community-facing work is also something that we've engaged with, actually doing performances that are not just for professional audiences, but folks in churches, in schools, in libraries, where you actually touch your audience, you interact with them, and you bring them into your project. And finally, thinking about art for a fairer world. I presented this at an Artivism symposium. They've been doing a lot of exciting work around artivism at TUT. So when we think about art, how can we engage it in order to build that fairer world that we would like to see? So I will stop here and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Radhakrishnan. That was truly inspiring and captivating. Can we please give Professor Radhakrishnan a huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, via our virtual icons?
Thank you.
Wow, wonderful. So just in terms of reflecting on what Prof has shared with us, I think what has come through for me is essentially the role of the body in healing, and how we can physically express ourselves, or how one can physically express oneself in the process of healing, especially since through violence, whatever form of violence one experiences, the kind of trauma that's associated with that form of violence. But I think if we have to expand that a little bit in terms of physical movement, physiologically also we know that physical movement through exercise, yoga, dance, etc., would promote the release of endorphins, which ultimately improves mood and provides a sense of empowerment as well. And I think that's what Prof was able to show us, how using this body positively is such a powerful tool in the journey to healing. But I think what you also said or showed us was able to demonstrate, articulately the mind-body connection. And of course, again, it is about the trauma on the body, but the trauma on the mind as well, and how in conjunction with each other, I think when the two are in sync, the healing process is probably facilitated. And it's really interesting that the site of hurt and harm can actually be the site for healing at the same time. So with that, Prof. Smita, I want to open the floor for discussions, and I can see Spamandla has his or her hand raised. Let's go ahead and take your question.
Prof, before Spamandla, Dr. V had raised a question earlier during the discussion. So she was asking, Spamandla, we are going to come to you just now. She said, how does dance bring justice and care to gender issues, drawing this from the feminist perspective?
All
I
right.
mean, I think, should I just respond, or are we going to collect a few, or?
I think let's collect a few. So that's one. Let's go to Smandla.
Okay.
Are you able to unmute Smandla?
Sorry,
All right.
that's a mistake. I'm so sorry.
Pardon?
We can hear you now. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
that's a mistake. It's a mistake. I'm so sorry.
All right, no problem. Please, Prof. Smita, go ahead and you can respond to Venencia's question in the meantime.
Okay, let me just read the question again then. How does dance bring justice and care to gender issues, drawing this from the feminist perspective?
I think that was the whole talk, so I don't know how to quickly answer it, but maybe could the questioner give a little bit more detail, because I think so, feminism does highlight the body and and sort of thinks about speaking from the perspective of those who are surviving and those who are marginalized. And so I'm talking about not dance in general, but a particular kind of dance that draws in the perspectives of those who have experienced marginalization and puts that at the center. I think that's the quickest answer that I can give. But yeah, I mean, I think that sure, could dance be used for non-feminist purposes? I suppose, but I'm trying to mobilize it to think about, drawing from that cultural context, that cultural well, right, and centering the experiences of those who have experienced harm in order to promote that kind of healing. So it's a particular kind of dancing together, dancing in synchrony, and for an audience. Or socially dancing, right, in a community, which includes everyone, in order to activate those endorphins, kind of activate those neurological processes in order to come to terms with grief in a safe space, and also to build community, which feminist visions of justice are all about, moving our basis of care outside of the nuclear family or just a romantic relationship, and really building a resilient community that cares for all. And I think dance needs to be a very critical part of what a feminist community does.
Thank you very much, Prof. Can I go over to Prof. Shania Rubin, and then we'll come back to the questions in the chat.
Thank you, Prof. Prof. Smita, I have absolutely delighted in your presentation. I just think it's so beautiful, and you touched on so many things that are close to my heart. In my teaching, I often reflect on, an intersectional perspective. You speak about the whole person, communities of care, agency and power. I really do see dance as such a powerful tool. It's a non-verbal kind of outlet for kind of expressing trauma. And just to kind of also just step back a little, Prof. Gopal mentioned, this connection between mind and body. And if you look at it from a psychological perspective, for instance, if we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, I mean, that is what we teach. What you think, right, then translates into how you feel, and how you feel then translates into how you behave. So yeah, I mean, this is just so powerful. And what I found, so beautiful is how you took these very complex issues, right? Like, we talk about agency, we talk about power, and, oftentimes it's so complicated to kind of explain these constructs to students. But this is such a beautiful way to kind of simplify it in a way that students can receive, or not just students, that people can receive. So yeah, really, really beautiful. So I don't really have a question at this time, but really just a comment. So thank you so much for your presentation. Really beautiful.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Professor. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Shania.
From Nigel in the chat, who asks, how can dance be used to prevent GBV?
So that's a open question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if it can be used to prevent it. The way that I presented it in the webinar was to think about it as an instrument of healing, right? So if GBV is happening, right, and then dance can be used to heal it. But I also think that there are some preventative dimensions, and that actually builds on what Shania was just saying, which is that when you are in touch with your body, when you are moving, when you are, then it allows you to have a kind of awareness of your whole self that is distinct. Now, does it mean that if you're a dancer, you will never be a victim of GBV? I think that's a little too simplistic, right? And that's where you need that multiscalar perspective, right? Because if you are in an environment where there's actually no place to dance because it's such a dense urban environment and there's no open space at all that you have access to, or if you dance in public, you will be harmed, right? That's not like very helpful. So thinking with the dance lens, how do we create a community where there is space for people to engage with one another and to dance and to have caring touch and to build community? Having a more caring community where dance is possible, right, makes it less likely that there could be GBV. Maybe, right? And I don't want to generalize here because I know that there is a huge diversity of experiences, and I'm not here to be prescriptive about that, but merely to provide a kind of perspective that links our environment and the kinds of harms that occur on an everyday basis as a result of the environment that we live in, and the harms that are visited upon individual bodies, and how dance can actually mediate between those things in powerful ways. So it's not meant to be something prescriptive, but I do think it has a role to play.
Thank you very much, Smita. Shania, is that a legacy hand or a new one?
No, it is a new hand, but I'm happy to wait.
Please go ahead.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please do.
Smita, I just want your thoughts on this. I mean, so I did about 6 years of Bharatanatyam dancing when I was much younger. And I mean, I loved it. Everything that you spoke about today, I felt it because I've experienced that. And my kind of, for me, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a home where I would, if you looked at socioeconomic status, I would consider my family to be average, right? My parents were both teachers, and therefore they had the means to be able to send me for dance class, right? I grew up in what we would call historically Indian community, where there were lots of people who were dancers, and they would offer the service at a cheap cost. It was affordable. But the reality is now, particularly kind of reflecting on our socioeconomic status in South Africa, or rather, the economy, many people don't have this, sort of opportunity, so I love that, towards the end of your presentation, you spoke about critical pedagogy. Yeah. And I just want to take that one step further. What are your thoughts around something like this being taught or made available in schools? So we have sport. Sport is front and center in many schools, more so in our kind of private schooling, but even in our government schools, sports, it's part of the curriculum, right? So we have life orientation. This is the subject area that students, cover. I'm just thinking, to make this sort of powerful tool accessible, should something like this be integrated into basic education? Thanks, Prof.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up, Shania, because I think that I mentioned it kind of in passing in the talk, but I think one of the most devastating parts of all of this is actually dance has become elite. It's become something that, people feel that they need some special qualification in order to do, that they need some kind of, it's only restricted to women, or to, if in the Indian community, Bharatanatyam taught by particular teachers, or, whatever, when we go back in all of our ancestral traditions, whether in Africa, India, or elsewhere, dance is fundamental to being human. So yes, we need to bring it back in the school. Yes, we need to bring it back to where it is just a fundamental part of existing, right? There is no one who doesn't feel more alive when they're dancing, right? I mean, at least once they've overcome the stigma or the shame of feeling, oh, I'm not a good dancer, oh, I don't do that, right? We have all of these kinds of barriers, I guess, to being able to move our bodies in sync, but moving in sync is the most natural thing. Right. And I think there is, bringing it to the schools is really important. So Professor Govender, Surya Govender, has been, when I was living in Durban back in the early 2000s, I was actually working in schools, and they have been bringing, a few dances, Asimbonanga and African Dream, and some of these dances that were very key in articulating that post-apartheid movement to schools that don't otherwise have those resources. And Sri Lanka dancers have long been coming and teaching in schools. And, there isn't a ton of support for it, right? And so for those dancers for whom that would be their income and their living, it's actually not funded well enough for them to be able to do that full time, right? Like, and so there's a lot of, economic structures. I think if we're thinking about dance as a modality and as a tool in schools and democratizing it and actually taking it seriously as part of a larger set of interventions that can be used to foster the kind of world that we would like to live in, building that community resilience, then it does involve democratizing dance and connecting it, not just to, I'm talking about it from the perspective of a South Asian immigrant, but even bringing African forms into schools. Like making sure that those are things that are accessible and part of everyday life and not stigmatized and not something to be, put like squirreled away right in a corner, but actually something that is a part of, that's cultivated in public life. I think that's super, super important, and is definitely what I would hope is one of the main interventions or takeaways from the message I'm trying to convey.
Thank you so much for that, Smita, and thank you, Shania. I did see Prim Naidu's hand raised before I go to Tando. Is Prim still with us? Tando, are you able to see if Prim is still with us?
I think Prim's question was answered about dance and prevention of GBV.
All right. Please go ahead, Tando.
Prim is still here, Prof, but I think that the question was answered. Okay, so firstly, there was Cindy in the chat who said, someone once said, dance is the most universal of the arts because doing so, it requires nothing other than one's own body, whether happy or sad. The body is universal and belongs to every individual. Okay, so that was just a comment. No, I did have something to say. I was just reading that from the chat.
Sure.
Okay, so
can I just add one thing to that? I think that's very, very beautiful, and that resonates with me deeply. But I also want to bring in a little bit of a disability perspective here, which is that not everybody has access to their body in the same way. And I think, part of inclusive pedagogy and kind of if we really start thinking about what would it mean to bring dance to everybody, right, then it means that we need to also shift away from ableist understandings that dance is only something that you can do if you are slim-bodied, if you look a certain way, if you are strong, but rather something that can belong to bodies of all abilities. I try to, when I'm teaching a class right now that's an all abilities class, and what we do is we make sure that you dance with whatever capacity your body has. So if you can't stand today, then you can dance with your hands, right? And you can dance with your face, and you can still convey ideas and express yourself with whatever it is that you have that is available to you, right? And so owning the body in that way, regardless of what its capacity is, has to also be part of the healing that we want to do in the world.
Thank you so much for that, Smita. Tando, please go ahead with your question before we move to Prim.
Okay, so it was more a comment than a question, but I just wanted to thank Prof. Smita, and I think it's a great thing to have such platforms where we actually get to, I think, do a lot of learning and unlearning at the same time. And I think that the key thing in this presentation is getting a holistic sense in terms of healing, where we integrate the mind, the heart, and the body, and they become in sync, as Prof. Gopal had mentioned earlier on. And allowing these three to be in sync means that you will be able to achieve a more holistic, a more wholesome sense of healing, as opposed to if you're treating or you're trying to heal each of these differently, or maybe tackling them individually. So I think more than anything, these are very huge injustices that we speak of in terms of gender-based violence. Also, we are still at a battle where we are trying to reach a consensus in terms of the conceptualization of this big term, which is actually very spectral, as Prof. Smita had actually mentioned. So I think more than anything, it's a thing that is very personal, very individualistic in terms of healing, where something that may work for this person may not work for the next person. So I think more than anything, then in terms of radical love, it's just a thing of trying to love yourself, trying to heal yourself as a person individually, and then also going out into the community now, having that radical love and actually generating love within that community setting, where you are also able to spread healing, through socialization, through all these different relationships that you form with people within the spaces that you actually immerse yourself within. So I think that was a very, very powerful talk, and we should definitely have more of these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tando. So, Smita, I think that was Tando's praise for your
Thank you so much.
For your presentation. Can we move over to Prim?
Hi, thanks, Prof. Smita and Prof. Gopal. I just wanted to add on, Prof. Smita, thanks. You just brought me back to the idea of going back to our ancestral forms of dancing. Because when you think of ancient times, at the end of a long week of gather hunting or just working even 100 years ago, people used to sit and they may smoke the peace pipe, or they'll be singing using the ancestral musical instruments, singing and dancing and just releasing that stress of the work week before they went out, maybe trying to hit somebody. I'm not saying they still wouldn't do it, but I think it was definitely reduced. And I think what we're doing today is we're sitting behind these screens and being so isolated and not in community with each other, whether it's singing or dancing, playing musical instruments, chatting together around that fire. And that just allows us to de-stress and let all the hurt and pain and anxiety of a boss who's been really hard on us that week, or a wife or a husband who's been shouting at us, but just to speak with family, with friends. And I think it's important to go back to those indigenous knowledge systems to find out, how did we prevent violence all those years before we were all colonized, and what did we do? And dance is one of it, and there's definitely other forms. But thank you so much for taking me back to Africanizing and indigenizing our curriculum. Thanks so much. Go well. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I definitely agree with all of those things. I think that's where we can get creative with, thinking about how to expand the lens, right? And so when you connect with indigenization of curriculum, of learning, and all of those things, and I didn't talk about colonialism in the talk, but this entire perspective is a decolonizing perspective, because it's advocating for a complete integration of an understanding of structural harm with what's happening at the individual level, which is exactly what colonial or processes don't want us to do. They want us to isolate the body as if it's outside of that, right? Outside of a community, outside of these violent processes that constitute our everyday life. And, I think we can't go without saying that, if everybody doesn't have enough to begin with, it's pretty hard to sort of build the world that you want, right? So those of us who do have to have that privilege really have to do that thinking and that world building, and bring other folks on board into that beloved community in order to be able to push back against those violent processes. And I think that's that's that multi-scalar lens, right, that we need to be engaging in, and that historical lens.
Thank you so much for that, Smita, for those responses. Whilst we are
Prof?
waiting for,
I think
is
Vanessa
somebody-
asked something.
I'm sorry, Prof, to interject.
Go
I can't
ahead.
see where I'm supposed to react or raise a hand on this platform.
Go ahead.
Yes. So I just want to add something. As Prof. Smith was actually presenting, I was asking myself, how does dance really, come into play, when it comes to feminist issues and care and so forth? What role does it play basically in the healing process? But as her presentation unfolded, I was actually taken aback to think, okay, I've researched that I've done in gender-based violence. And looking into it from an African perspective, we always think of, structures that are there. Can I go and speak to a psychologist? Can I go and speak to someone, so that I can heal, But there are these systems, I would love to call them indigenous knowledge systems, You can use dance, not as an escape, but as an exercise or a platform that you can actually, take in consideration for you to heal, for you to move on from whatever you have actually experienced. So thank you very much, Prof. Smita. I think I just got another perspective, in terms of gender-based violence. And if you're open, to collaboration on a paper with Prof. Gopal, I'm more than welcome to be on board. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's so wonderful to hear. I'm glad to hear about that, and I'd be pleased to be in touch about that.
Thank you, Venetia. Thank you, Smita. So I think we have a few minutes to close, but I would like to, I don't want to say abuse my role as the chairperson, but perhaps take a minute as well. Smita, as I was listening to your presentation, but also in terms of the comments and the questions that came through from the audience, and perhaps because we are all in a very similar context, and that is the South African context, I think about my own role as a basic education teacher. I spent 14 years in basic education, and one of my, a space that I really enjoyed, and I must admit, I'm one of those persons who's really ashamed about the fact that I don't know how to dance. But I think what I did during my time as a teacher is that we oftentimes we had these concerts, or not just concerts, but we would have festivities, etc. And for some reason or the other, I was probably one of the bravest teachers to go out there and not be ashamed of my inadequacies. And I would bring together groups of students from, different cultures, different contexts, and we would fuse Western and African music, Western African dance, singing, etc. And I think, as you said, and Shania made reference to it as well, it was just such a beautiful time, because it was a time when we, besides just enjoying it as a form of art, I think what it did to the mind was just amazing. And it lifted us into, I think actually transcended us into a world of peace and calm and enjoyment, even though it could have been transient, but it gave us that beautiful peace at the time. And I'm reminded then, as university staff, as students, postgrad, undergrad, etc., I'm not sure if we realize how privileged we are. And through that privilege, given the fact that dance there shouldn't be a cost attached to dance, because the body is organic, dance is organic. Like you say, you can't dance with your feet, dance with your hands, dance with your face, etc. What stops us from being ambassadors for dance and adopt a community? And there are grounds, we have fields, parks, and bring together young people and let's just dance. And trust me, South Africa is a nation of dancers.
Absolutely.
It's just so organic. So yeah, I think,
So
I'd
we've
like to
got
put
the
it out there.
knowledge, we have the enthusiasm. It just, when you mobilize that, right, then you are actually helping to build community, when people have very
Absolutely.
outlets to do that. When I was in Durban a few months ago, I spent some time in Welbydad and Chatsworth, and my research is about household debt. And, I was struck by the pervasiveness of things like, cholesterol, high blood pressure, these health issues, and just no space to move around, just very, very restricted. And then people are facing economic difficulties, and it absolutely affects their bodies. Absolutely affects their bodies. And there's very few options for things to do. If there were more opportunities, right, not just for kids, but for adults also, to, move in sync with one another in some way that was sexy and fun and inviting, right? And free of cost or low cost. What kind of a transformative impact could that have? Of course, once you get over the stigma, and it's a long journey. I'm not saying that, just like set up a dance hall and all will be well, but I think that knowledge and that enthusiasm is there already. So it's about tapping into it in a way that would actually reach people, that it does build community and trust, and all the research shows that.
Absolutely. But Smita, I want to at this point hand over to Shania, who's going to move the vote of thanks.
Thanks very much, Prof. Gopal. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude this webinar, which I think I can describe as both powerful, thought-provoking, it is my absolute pleasure to deliver this vote of thanks. The discussions we've had today could not be more relevant. In a country where GBV intersects with the legacies of apartheid, structural inequalities, and ongoing socioeconomic struggles, true healing requires more than just legal or policy reform. It calls for cultural and emotional restoration. And Prof, you have demonstrated this so powerfully today. Firstly, we want to express our heartfelt thanks to Prof. Gopal, whose remarkable leadership in a project titled BRICS Security Systems as an essence of fruitful cooperation has made today possible. Prof. Gopal's unwavering commitment to promoting dialogue and creating safe spaces for critical discussions is indeed truly inspiring. As a woman making profound strides in academia and social justice, Prof. Gopal stands as a testament to the power of women in leadership driving change. Prof. Gopal's contributions remind us that as women, we are not just subjects of the fight against gender-based violence, but powerful agents of change in the movement towards a safer and more equitable world. To Prof. Smita, thank you for your incredible presentation today. Your unique blend of feminist sociology and artistic practice, especially through dance, has opened up new pathways of healing. Your work reminds us that the deep wounds of violence requires creative approaches that address the heart, body, and mind, and that women, through their unique experiences and perspectives, are often at the forefront of this healing process. Prof, you stand as a powerful example of how women continue to drive meaningful change. Your contribution is a testament to the strength and resilience of women, reminding us that true transformation begins with courageous voices just like yours. We also want to extend our sincere thanks to Thando for organizing this event and all of the logistics. Thando, your attention to detail and your coordination has ensured that this webinar has run so smoothly. And then, as Prof mentioned earlier on to Kurt, we also want to extend our deepest thanks to you for your technical support. And thank you for always providing us with a service, both that is efficient, but you also just do it with such excellence and joy. So many thanks to you, Kurt. We'd also like to thank all of our participants and our attendees for your engagement, questions, and your dialogue. We truly value your diverse insights. So, ladies and gents, as we close, let us reflect on this quote. So, one of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy, I want you to listen and listen carefully. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And I think that is just so beautiful. And it speaks to so much of what you have presented today, Prof. So ladies and gents, in our collective fight against gender-based violence, may we remember that through our efforts, whether it's through research, art, activism, dialogue, we are actively building a new world. One step, one voice, one song, and one dance at a time. We thank you.
Can I invite everyone to turn their mics on, and let's say a huge thank you to Prof. Smita. I'm going to count to 3, guys. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Prof. Smita. I didn't hear the others. I'm a lone voice. All right, but thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Everyone can speak because I need to allow them permission to speak. So I literally did that as fast as I could, and some could say it.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you to the audience as well. Shania, thank you, everyone. Until we meet again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.